Okay, so we're back on the air. So it's part 1 of lesson 12. We're going to try and get as much of this Beanstack app built today, this little task list, as we can. So a couple things we're going to do to get set up. The first thing we need to do, the second item here, is a Mongo insert script. So it will probably be easier today if you have MongoDB running. If you open a command prompt, now actually probably everybody, so the first thing you need to do is open a command prompt and start your local MongoDB. So you just browse into your MongoDB path and launch the MongoD process and set up the path to your data folder. Your alternative is to open a command prompt, go into the directory where you have MongoDB installed, run the Mongo command, but you'll have to get your connection string from MLab if you want to connect to your MLab database. I'm just going to work locally today. So I'll leave this command prompt running, command window running. I now have an active connection to my local Mongo Lab database. Sorry, my local MongoDB. So once you have that running, I want you to open a second command prompt. And once again, browse into whatever directory you've installed MongoDB into. So on my machine, inside of my node folder, I'll go into my MongoDB directory. And now we want to run the Mongo command, because what we want to do is seed or pre-populate a database. So we run the command Mongo. This stuff is all right here on Blackboard. So we're going to run the command Mongo. We're going to run a use command. I mean, you can just copy and paste those 5 lines into your command prompt. We're going to say we want to use the tasks database. That doesn't exist, but that will create it if it doesn't exist. And then there's 3 inserts. We're going to insert 3 tasks. Task 1, task 2, task 3, and we'll set each one as completed equals false. So you can just copy that whole block. And once you're in your MongoDB directory, wherever you've installed MongoDB on your machine, you can just paste and hit enter and it'll run those 5 commands. So you don't have to type any of them. And then to check if your tasks are inserted, if I just execute the command db.tasks.find, oh, wrong database. So it should show you, I have 4 tasks in mind. It should show you the 3 records being inserted. So now we have some data we can start with. There's one other thing that we're going to need, which is on Blackboard. Rather than building out an Express application and connecting to the database and doing those things, I've pre-built an application template for you. And that template is right here, the first item. So it says lesson12.zip. So what I want you to do is grab this zip file and extract it into your node folder, whatever folder on your computer you're running node in, and it will have an Express application that I've already set up for you. It already uses NodeMon. It already has a task model with title and completed fields. I'm going to skip having you guys do that stuff. I've kind of pre-built it to save us some time so we can focus on the Angular piece. So grab the lesson 12 folder. And if you just save it to your node directory, and once it's saved, if you just say extract here, it's already in a folder called lesson 12, so you don't need to build another lesson 12 folder. I've zipped the whole folder, so I'll just say extract here. And now you should have a lesson 12 folder with an Express application. Okay, so this is our starting point. I kind of saved us the class time of having everybody build this and add some stuff to it. So just download that zip file, put it in your node folder, and extract it. It'll build the lesson 12 folder for you. So I'm going to open this up in my code editor now. We can see what's in here. So mostly it's just what the Express generator does. I've added a few things in to save us time. So I'll show you the pieces that I've added. It's nothing new. It's all stuff we've done several times before. To get it to run? Yeah. You shouldn't if you're working on your local database. Well, we'll open it up and I'll show it to you. The only thing you may have to change is potentially your database.
Well, it says that there's an unexpected
Oh, okay. Well, let's see. I may have to fix that. So here's our project. It looks like your basic run-of-the-mill Express application. I'll show you quickly the changes I made. In package.json, I changed the start from node to nodemon, so we can use nodemon. In app.js, I've added Mongoose, and I've set up a database configuration file with the URL that goes to localhost/tasks. So if you're not using your local MongoDB, if you're using MongoLab, you're obviously going to have to take your connection string from the MongoLab control panel and put it in here to replace mine. This only works if you're running MongoDB locally. But if you are, then it's already set up. So in app.js, I used Mongoose, and I've installed Mongoose into node modules. So we're connecting to our database. I've created a simple model, a task.js. It's really simple. Every task has a title, which is a string, and a completed field, which is a true or false, and we default it to false. When we first add a task, it's not complete. So I've created this file, but there's nothing new here. We've seen all this stuff before. Inside of public, I added a, if you want a favorite icon in a node application, here's where it goes. You call it favicon.ico and put it in the root of your public directory. And then in app.js, normally this line is commented out. Once you have a favorite icon in the public directory, if you uncomment, that makes that favorite icon active. So I've included a little mean stack icon and enabled it. Inside of JavaScript, I've pre-downloaded 2 Angular files. So this is the angular.min.js. So this is the base Angular library we've been working with over the last few weeks. This file is for doing Angular routing, so routing on the front end. We'll only need it for one small thing today. So I've already downloaded it and included it. I've got the Bootstrap theme and basic Bootstrap here. I don't think I changed anything. Sorry, I did change a couple things. So in our roots, I didn't create any new roots or views. We don't need any. It's going to be a single page application using Angular. So our root file is exactly the same. It just loads the index view. I did change quite a bit of stuff. So what I did on the index view is I set up a template. So I added Bootstrap and the two Angular JavaScript files at the bottom. And I've kind of set up our HTML template for our task list. So it's basically just a simple form. So there's a text box and an add button in our form. And down below, there's a section with an unordered list where we'll display the tasks that are in the database. So we should be able to run the application right now using npm start. And we'll have just a bit of HTML, like there's no data yet. We're going to use Angular and Node to build all that stuff. So I'm just going to go out of here. So I'm going to go into my lesson 12 folder. I'm going to run npm start and see if I can actually get my application running. So I should use NodeMon because I have NodeMon in package.json. I'll just leave that one open. So this is what the page looks like. If I put stuff in right now, really nothing happens. So the first thing we want to have happen on this page is we want to use the full stack to display the current tasks. We have 3 tasks in our database already. As soon as the page loads, our current task list should get populated. So that's going to be step 1. We'll do a read operation, right? Let's read the information out of our database using our model and our controller, and we're going to use Angular to display it here. That'll be step 1. Step 2, once we have that working, is we're going to work on our form. So we can type in a title and hit add. We want to create that record in the database and have our task list repopulate. And then if we get those working in our current task list, we'll also add the ability to delete and perhaps mark an item as completed. Okay. Any questions so far? Is everybody with me so far? Have your application running? You have an error?
Yeah.
On what file?
It says that it doesn't start at NodeMon.
And is there an error message any more than that? Carlin, do you have the same thing?
Mine cannot find module express.
Okay, if it says can't find module express, then do an npm install express. And then it will probably say there's other modules missing, so just install any module it tells you is missing. Mackenzie, is there any other information in your error message?
This is most likely a problem with the lesson 12 package, not npm itself.
Okay, the other thing you can try, you could close your code editor, rename the folder. Just a sec, Chelsea. You could rename the folder. You can use the express generator to build your own lesson 12, and then you could copy in the files that are here. So the config, the models, you could try copying files in that way.
I'm getting half crashed waiting for file changes before starting.
Okay, if you look up above that, there should be a more descriptive message that tells you where it crashed.
Starting node.bin.www.
There's no other information?
No.
Is your MongoDB running?
No. Connection failed.
Okay, so you have to get your MongoDB. You either have to have your local MongoDB running, or you have to change the connection string and use your database on MLab, one or the other. But it tries to connect to a database right away as soon as it launches. So if it's not connecting, so I've set it up so that it connects to your local host with a tasks database. So you either need to connect there or need to connect to your database on MLab.
I just had to install NodeMon locally.
Okay.
I've had that issue.
So NodeMon may not be installed globally on your machine. Right, I've installed it globally, so it's not in the node modules. Okay, so the first thing we need to do is we need to start making our own Angular JS file that is going to do all of the controls, all the stuff we've done over the last few weeks in Angular. So inside of JavaScript, we're going to make a new Angular file. We need to make a module and we need to make a controller. And then we need to attach that module and controller inside of either maybe our HTML or our body tag in our template. So that is what will allow us to connect certain parts of our HTML, the elements in our DOM, to elements in our AngularJS file. So I'll go into the JavaScript folder here. So inside of public and JavaScript, I'm going to make a new JavaScript file, which I will call task-app.js. So this is where all the Angular code we're going to write today, it's all going to go in one file. Doesn't really matter. The name isn't important. You can call it something else if you want. Now, in many examples, some of the code that we're going to put all in one file that actually gets split into separate files. To keep it simple today, we're just going to put all our Angular code in one place. I'll show you an example later, maybe where it's split up. Okay. So now inside of my JavaScript, I have a blank JS file called task app. I'll maybe just put in a note here saying something like custom Angular file for managing tasks. We don't need this. I'll just put in a comment of what we're doing. So like we've done with Angular the last couple of weeks, we're going to create an Angular module and we're going to create an Angular controller. And then we'll link those things to the HTML tags in our index page. We're going to create a variable which we'll just call app, and we'll set it equal to an angular.module. And now we have to provide a name for our module, which I'll just call task app. And the second thing we need whenever we create a module is we need to list an array of any dependencies that this module has. We'll need some dependencies later, but to get started, we'll just put in 2 square brackets, meaning an empty array. So our module is called task app, and it has no dependencies on any other Angular libraries for now. And now we'll create the Angular controller. We'll call it a task controller. And we also have a callback function. We've used scope the last couple weeks in our Angular controller. Anybody explain what scope, what $scope means? That's a keyword in Angular. It has a particular meaning. How have we used scope in the past? Adam? Yeah, absolutely. So it's basically our kind of our global that can be seen by both our controller and our HTML. So if we have variables or functions, we can pass them back and forth and refer to them in the controller by calling them scope. So we've just set up a blank. Now, what will we have to do? We'll save those changes. We have to do 3 things in our index.ejs, which is just an HTML template. And I know it doesn't, we've been working with HTML documents in Angular. Today we're going to use Angular within our EJS, but this is just an HTML document. What things do we have to do in here so that this page can talk to our Angular file? We need to do 3 things. Right, so let's go down to the bottom where we have our JavaScript links. And after our Angular links, let's set up nothing's going to work. That should always be step one. This is like HTML 101, right? We have an HTML page that wants to use some JavaScript in a separate file. Well, we better add a link to the JavaScript file.
Is case sensitive?
No.
So should the T and task be
Yeah, it should be. Actually, it's a good question. Yeah, well, my code editor says it can't find it that way. The reality is it also depends on the server, whether it's case sensitive or not. Depends on the operating system. Okay, so now our template's connected to the JS file. We have to do two other things that we've done in our previous lessons, and we have an HTML page and we want it to use components in the Angular file. So we've linked the script. What else do we need to do? We need to add some stuff to some of our HTML tags. Here, maybe I'll open the file from our file from last week and we can have a quick look at it. So here was our to-do list, our Angular and HTML. Yeah, we need to connect our module as well as our controller to elements in the DOM. Now, where we put them, it doesn't really matter. We could do it this way. We could, the module on the HTML tag and the controller to the body. We could put them both on the HTML. You could put them both on the body. Doesn't matter, because then they'll apply to everything within those elements. We may as well do it the same way we've done it here. So in our HTML tag, we'll set our ng app equal to our to-do app. So this has got a map, sorry, good thing I checked. It's not the to-do app, it's called the task app. So because we're putting it on the HTML tag, anything within the DOM underneath the HTML has access to that module. And on our body, maybe we'll set the ng controller here. So anything in our body can be manipulated by the task controller, which is fine. If we wanted to change things in the head section, like let's say the title, then we'd probably want to set the ng controller up here as well, because the head is inside of HTML, but it's not inside the body. For our purposes today, we're only going to be manipulating the body, so it's okay that it goes on our body tag. So we should be able to refresh our page here. Still runs. Things are linked up, but really nothing's happening yet. So we've got our ng app, our ng controller, and we have our JavaScript link. So now what we need to do is we want to start to populate this section. We can do the HTML part of it first. So I've created an empty UL tag. So what we want to have here is in a list, we have 3 tasks in our database. So we want to populate this section with all of the tasks in our database. So we want to have li tags where we display the title, the task of the title, and then we have a delete button, a red delete button beside the name of the task. So the HTML is going to look like this, and then we'll have to add the Angular piece. So we'll have an li, obviously. We'll give it a class of list group item, which is a bootstrap class. And then within here, we'll put on a span tag that will display the task of the title and then a button beside it. And we'll make these a standard width. So no matter how big or how small the task titles are, they're all the same width, and our delete buttons will align. So this is just HTML only so far. We'll make our buttons red. We use BTN danger. So this is the HTML part of it. If we go back and refresh in the browser, we won't see anything yet. Actually, sorry, we will see one empty list item, I think, because we've hard-coded one item in the list, right? So by using the call small 6, it pushes the delete button over here. But we want this list to repeat, right? We don't want to hard-code it in. This list needs to be dynamic. If there's 10 tasks in the database, there needs to be 10 LI tags. So this is the HTML part. Now we need to write all the back-end code to go and get that list of tasks, and then we can use Angular to wire it up. What will we need to do here? How will we connect up this section? We did it last week. How will we connect it up so that list is dynamic? We'll have to add an Angular attribute to one of these tags. You're close. Look at our task list from last week. So what attribute, what Angular directive does the looping here? And what line number do you see it? Yeah, it's in the LI. And what's the Angular directive in the LI tag? Yeah, so there's our ng repeat. So we'll leave this part out for now. We'll write all the code to query the database and fetch all the data. And then once we have it, we're going to need to add something similar here. That will loop through all our tasks and generate an LI tag for every task we have in our list. Okay. And we don't need the model, but we'll use the handlebars or the mustache syntax to print out the title of the task. And then later on, we're also going to need this. On our delete button, we'll need the ng click directive that will call a delete function in our Angular file. Right? So we're kind of getting there, and then later on we can also print out how many tasks we have, again using the handlebars. So let's go to, let's see, what do we want to do first? I think the first thing we need to do is we're going to open up our roots and index.js. So we now need to write the server-side code that will use our model and fetch the data from our MongoDB. So we already know how to do this. We've done this before. The only difference is when we've done this previously, we got a get request and we call the find method. We would still return a view. If I open up, let's say, look at our, let's go to our maybe lesson 9. If we look at our roots. So for articles, you know, we did something like this. Right? We had a get request we called article.find. We've got a bunch of data back. We loaded a view and we passed back all the data we got. With Angular, we're still going to use our model and call find, but we no longer load the view directly from our controller. All we do is we simply render all of the data as a JSON object. We send the data back to Angular as JSON. And Angular will interpret that JSON and it will decide what to render on our page. So we're putting a new step in the middle. The way that it worked in this application was we had our view, which made a request to the root file, which went to the model and sent data back to the root, and the root loaded the view and passed it the data. So there were kind of 3 pieces: view, controller, model, back to the controller, back to the view. Because with Angular, we want this two-way data binding, Angular now sits in the middle. So it's now our view, Angular, our root, and model. So there's something in between now, which makes our root files actually simpler. So in here, we're going to write the get tasks. So in this case, our URL, when we have a GET request at localhost 3000/tasks, we'll still do our usual callback function. Request response, next. So now we need to use our task model here and call find. That will get all the tasks from our database. Same thing we've already done. You did it in your assignment. So we want to get the tasks from our model and send them back in JSON. So we'll call task.find. And when we call task.find, that'll run a query against our MongoDB, and we're going to get back one of two things. Either an error or a bunch of data. If we get an error, we just call return next and send back the error. If we got back a bunch of tasks, we got data back, our query was successful. In fact, we don't even really need the else. I'll take the else out because if an error happens, our function exits here. It just returns. So I can actually take out the else. So all we want to do is send back, we can call response.json. So our task list is already in JSON because it lives in a MongoDB. We're just going to send the JSON data back to Angular. So we're no longer loading the views directly in our server-side root file. We're just querying the database and sending back any information in JSON. And all of our other functions in this application are going to do the same. They're no longer going to load views. They just send back JSON and interact with our database. So this should be all we have to do on the server end to query the database and pull the task list out. But now, instead of sending it straight to the view, which is what we did before, load this view and send it the data, we're going to hand that data back to Angular instead. It seems like an extra step in the process, right? It is an extra step in the process. But what this will allow us to do is by handing the data to Angular, Angular can manage that two-way data binding that we looked at a couple of weeks ago that we don't get when we leave Angular out. So what we need to do in here now is in our controller, we're going to need to set up a function that will get the tasks and send them back to the view using our scope global. So this is the part that gets a little bit complicated. We're going to write some code here. We also have to create what's called an Angular. So the controller, this part is what interfaces with our HTML. I guess maybe I'll add that. We also need a piece in here to talk to our server-side route, to talk to this page. Now, in many applications, they would break this Angular file up into two, an Angular controller and an Angular service. So the service is what talks to our server side, and the controller is basically what talks to our client side. We're going to do it all in one file because it's just going to be a little simpler for today. If I showed you another mean stack example, you might see here a task service and a task controller as two separate files. So we're going to create, also known as a There are some slight differences between an Angular factory and an Angular service. They're not really relevant for our purposes of today. You can certainly read about it. The main reason we want this is this controller, if the user leaves our page, any data that was on there, it goes out of scope and we lose it. Whereas when we have used this factory, it kind of can persist to our server data. So we want to create here what's called in Angular an app, a factory. We give it a name. And then in square brackets, the callback function, the square brackets is so we can add a list of dependencies, which we will need to do a little bit later. Whoops, sorry, that goes, this square bracket goes here. So the simple way of thinking about it is this is the part that talks to the front end, this is the part that talks to the back end, and then they'll have to talk together. So in fact, instead of injecting one piece in between our view and our server-side route, we're actually injecting two pieces. So this is Angular's server-side part, and this is Angular's client-side part, is a simple way of thinking about it. The first thing we'll do is initialize an empty task list here. And this value will get filled by our JSON that we wrote over here. When we call a get method at task, we're going to get back JSON. So for starters, we'll just use a variable called O, which will be equal to an empty array. Say return O. So this will represent the data that we get back from our roots index.js file. Now what we need to do is set up a function we're going to create a get tasks function. So this will, well, we'll see what it does. It's a callback with no parameters. Now what we need here, we need to make an HTTP request to /tasks. We want to invoke this function here in our server. We want to make a new GET request at the URL /tasks. Well, what happens when the user makes a GET request there? We're going to query the database, find any tasks, and send them back as a JSON object. So we want to trigger this to happen from our front end. Angular is saying, go here and do this and get this data. So what we need is to return, we're going to use Angular's HTTP library. We'll need to add a reference to this. And in here, we want to call a GET request. What's the URL we want to call? Yeah, slash tasks. So when there is a get request at slash tasks, if it's successful, we will get back some data. So there's our callback function. And a semicolon here. Oops, and we need a round bracket closing. So what we want to do, we've got back some data. We want to copy it into our local array called tasks. So this will be the JSON data we get back from our root file. We now want to copy that into this local array. We use the Angular copy function. I'm going to copy the data into our tasks object. So this calls the server, queries the database, fetches a bunch of JSON data, which we are now copying into this array. So now our factory, if there's any data found from our query, we have it in as a JSON object. So we've put something in the way. We've put our Angular file is in the way now. We didn't have this file before. We went straight from our index.js straight to our view. Rather than sending the data to our view, our root file on the server, all it does is send back JSON data. That's it. It's not connected up to the front end. We now send that back to Angular. So later on, we're going to add an add task function. What do you suppose that's going to get changed to? When we're adding a new task. Yeah, we're going to, instead of sending a get request, we'll send a post request. And we'll write a post method here at slash tasks that we'll call task.save and save a new task. So Angular's now kind of in the middle. We need to do one other thing in our factory to make this work. We've used Angular's HTTP library. If we're going to use it, we need to list it as one of the dependencies for our factory. If our service is using HTTP, we have to link to it. So the syntax for doing this in Angular looks like this. So these square brackets, that indicates a dependency list. So in here, we need to add HTTP, and in our callback, we also need to add, without the quotes, HTTP. Our service wants to make an HTTP request, so we just have to link to the HTTP library. Otherwise, we're not going to be able to send get or post requests. So this is what allows our Angular JavaScript file to call functions in our server-side code. This is what the purpose of the service or factory is. Okay, this is kind of the bridge between our front-end JavaScript and our back-end JavaScript. So we had three pieces before. I know I'm being repetitive. That's on purpose. Before, we just had the view, the controller, and the model. We still have those pieces, but now we have our Angular factory sitting in between our view and our server-side root. So we have 4 pieces, and we're about to have 5.
I'm not getting the error right now that says unreachable code after return statement. Is the return statement supposed to be lower down? Or what's
Thank you. Yes, good point. The return statement should be the last line. Thanks, Brandon. After. Yeah, so we want to populate our o.tasks and then return the object. So we want to move this return object to the bottom. If we run our page right now, nothing should happen. We're still missing one step, which we'll take a break in a minute and we'll add this step after. So if I refresh, I have no errors. I can check my console. I don't think I'll have any errors. Yep, no errors here, but there's still no data on the page, right? So what we have to do, well, we're going to have to do something in our controller. Notice this section is still empty. We're going to take a break in a minute. We'll write this code after. So let's look at what we've got for a minute. We have a front end with just HTML. We have a back-end model that can talk to our database. We have a back-end server-side root file that can query the database. And we have an Angular factory that lets Angular call our get function in the server and get a bunch of JSON data. So what are we going to need to do after our break? What's kind of missing from this that we're going to need to add so that our page actually shows the tasks as soon as it loads? We'll have to do something in here, and we'll have to do something here. We've already talked about what we need to do here. Well, we're going to need these things again, right? We're going to need an ng repeat here. We're going to need to display the task title in our span. But we're also going to need to write the code in the controller to call this function. So we're fetching the data from the server, but we're not connecting it up yet with our scope variable. We haven't connected it up to our HTML. Our query's running, but it's not connected to anything on our front end yet. So we're going to have to now link them up. So link our HTML to the controller. We've done that piece, but now the controller needs to call this function and send the data back to our EJS. So that's going to be the next step. So this is getting broken up into many different sections. Our code is very modular here. And as I said, in other examples, it might be modularized even further, where typically the factory and the controller are in separate files. We're just going to do it all in one file. Okay. Let's take a pause here. We'll take a 10-minute break. We'll come back. We'll get our task list displaying. Then we'll work on adding a new task. Sure.